We are going to have to accept for the next 2 to 3 years very large fiscal deficits. But given how big those deficits are, I think it would be sensible to be cautious about going further in using discretionary measures to expand the size of those deficits. That's not to rule out targeted and selected measures that may find those areas, whether it's in the labour market, whether it's in corporate credit, that can do some good. But I think we, at the level of the fiscal position in the UK is not one that would say, well, why don't we just engage in another significant round of fiscal expansion?
I mean, I actually had a sharp intake of breath, because, he knew exactly what he was doing. He had timed it perfectly. And he says it in this little voice as if he's saying nothing. And, markets are falling.
And of course, we'd moved on by the time everybody's saying, you could see the faces around the table sort of going, did I hear that right? I must check the transcript later, and it became obvious just how big it was as time kind of went by.
It was described as cutting up the Chancellor's credit card, and I think it did have a constraining effect. I think the public perhaps began to realise for the first time just how dire our financial position actually is now.
One important issue was the role of the press. Had the media, by publicising Northern Rock's difficulties, caused the stampede of depositors to withdraw their cash? The story of the impending government bailout had been broken by Robert Peston, the ex-Financial Times journalist who'd recently become the BBC's business editor. Northern Rock made him into a household name.
Fear has been stalking the markets for weeks now. And frankly, if an institution of this sort got into really serious financial difficulties, well, heaven alone knows what impact that would have had on confidence in other banks, what it would have done to the stock market, and so on.
But did the very act of breaking that story ultimately doom Northern Rock?
Is it a case for journalists to exercise self-restraint and temporarily delay publication of a story, perhaps for a few hours or a day or two, where there is a risk that immediate publication would trigger widespread market turbulence or lead to the collapse of a particular institution? Robert.
Well,
sorry, I just picked you at random.
I mean, at the sort of risk of sounding slightly pompous and pretentious, it does seem to me there is a there is a public interest in letting millions of people know what's going on with their banks and what's going on with the economy. And if their banks are weaker than they think to be the case, then there's a public interest in telling them such. I think there is something about all that history, a bit of a cliche, the majesty of Parliament, that actually when you get there, I did feel, it was my first appearance, I think I did feel more nervous than I expected.
We never had the journalists along to blame them for the situation. That would have been absolutely absurd. So what we were looking at was for a deeper understanding of the crisis and how the press reported that.
One by one, they all claimed to have seen it earlier. It was a bit like Paris in 1946. They were all in the resistance then. But even these claims that they'd spotted earlier than anybody else, of course, were all buried away inside large property supplements that told you you were making a mistake if you weren't buying 6 buy-to-let flats in Belgrade. I mean, they were all part of this asset price bubble, and I don't think enough of them actually warned us against that at the time.
This was a story that I'd been following in some ways for years, actually. In 2003, I first identified Northern Rock as a bank whose business model I was a little bit concerned about. It seemed to me it was going far too fast. I wrote about it in the Sunday Telegraph. And for years I looked like a bit of a plonker because the share price went up and up and up. And the fact that I'd said I thought this may be heading towards some kind of an accident, looked wrong. I looked like an idiot.
Gillian Tett, certainly in a column written the day after Northern Rock received some, in retrospect, worthless City Banking Award for being the best bank of the year, actually wrote a column raising serious questions about the business model of Northern Rock. But that's not the same as saying Northern Rock is in trouble, the shares will go down, it may go bankrupt. I can assure you the writ would have been on my desk the next day. We couldn't do that.
And one of the things we learned is that how sharp the journalists were in comparison to the committee. And you kind of wish they were turning the tables, and that Robert Peston was sitting where John McFall was, and he was querying the committee saying, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And one of the journalists actually did say, well, you know, you're asking us why didn't we know? Well, why didn't you know?
Everybody has been taken completely by storm, if not by surprise, by this. I don't think anybody comes out with clean fingers. You know, we could just ask the same questions you're asking of us, of you. What have you been doing all this time? The answer is we really didn't know the full force of what was about to be unleashed on us, and that's the truth of the matter.
The credit crunch is going to be with us for years, probably decades to come. It'll be in our pensions, our public services, our tax bills, our job prospects. And having heard from the governors of the Bank of England, the powerful ministers, the bankers, the industry regulators, how did the Treasury Committee itself perform? Well, they issued a whole series of very weighty reports full of detailed recommendations on the future of the banking industry. And more than that, they fulfilled a different function. A kind of rough justice was dispensed here. Some said it was the modern equivalent of the pillory, or maybe the stocks.
People were beginning to suffer in their daily lives. People were extremely worried, and people were getting very cross about some of the things they were learning, and they jolly well wanted to know more. And there we were, available on live television. And therefore, I think we played a very important part in connecting the public with the event.
The committee was getting to an interesting place where they had much more confidence. They had much more kind of feeling of their own mission than they've ever had before. And I think, you know, it really gave you an idea of that select committees could be much more powerful than they are. I mean, they need to have some confidence too.
Look, every now and then I'd be watching a session and I'd be saying, why don't you ask this question? Or, and you get sort of slightly frustrated that, perhaps, the killer blow wasn't landed or a particular follow-up was somehow missed. But I'd say they were the exception to the rule.
You can't expect a committee not to grandstand from time to time. After all, it's going to, isn't it? And to a certain extent, that's what it's there for. It's there to call people to account.
I had friends in the city who were watching it on various channels who would kind of hush the dealing room and turn the sound up when we came on.
So you're telling me here, though, in answer to a question, Governor, that non-execs, we can't hope for them to do their job.
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm not saying that at all.
So what
I am saying is that the question you've asked is one that was asked in the past, and the fact that there is a crisis is in itself not evidence that the individuals in charge of those institutions necessarily failed.
But Governor, this is 2008. We've put £500 million into the banks. We've got 5,000 emails from people who are angry about these things. And you're telling us, look, things are going to go on as they are.
The power of the executive over years has been increasing, and we have to rebalance that power. And I think we're finding that newfound power in the select committee rooms.
You and nobody else has any guarantee or any solution that will lead you to a position.
But Governor, you were brought here as an expert to give us an idea of the way forward.
We have, and all the way through.
Well, tell us other than we'll see this again in 20 years' time. Give us some comfort.
Exactly, and ever since I came to this committee first, back in last September, I have spelt out for you exactly the direction in which you should go, and I'm glad to say you've listened.